For much of the world, the past 30 years or so has been a period of incredible progress and change. Smartphones, genetic engineering, AI, and electric cars are just some of the inventions that people across the globe have had access to. As the world becomes increasingly modernized, travel and communications have become faster and more efficient, enabling people and businesses to connect at unprecedented levels. In short, the developed world has become even more developed, and regions that have traditionally struggled to keep up, such as Southeast Asia and South America, are gradually beginning to evolve and move forward, with more stable governments and economies beginning to take shape. There is, however, a glaring exception to this worldwide pattern of continual growth and development: Africa. Africa remains the poorest and most underdeveloped region on the planet. In a 2023 ranking of countries with the lowest GDP per capita, 19 of the bottom 20 countries were in Africa. African countries have the lowest life expectancies of any other region in the world. Countries such as Chad and Nigeria have average life expectancies of around 55, which is roughly 20 years shorter than the global life expectancy. African countries have the world's lowest literacy rates and rank among the highest for political instability and civil war. With the exception of North America, the bulk of the continent has remained significantly underdeveloped, with poorly managed economies and weak governments. It's not as if Africa is bereft of resources. The combined countries have the world's most arable land, estimated to be about 65% of the global total. There's also a wealth of mineral deposits that are yet to be fully tapped into. Africa is sitting on 40% of accessible gold and almost 90% of the world's platinum and chromium, both of which are in huge demand. The continent is also projected to supply 80% of the world's natural gas extraction. What are the reasons, then, for Africa's inability to reach levels of development that at least match those of countries in South Asia and Latin America? There are several factors that have all played a major part in preventing Africa from progressing and developing. Africa has been plagued by political corruption, civil war, disease, famine, and economic exploitation for hundreds of years. Added to that is the continent's unfortunate history of enslavement and colonization, which began way back in the late 15th century. All of these issues have been major obstacles in allowing African countries to build democratic societies that are capable of modernizing and attracting much-needed investment. In order to fully understand how the continent has struggled, we have to start with the era of slavery. It was from here that Africa was always at a massive disadvantage to the rest of the world, and has yet to recover. The first known mass enslavement of African people began in the late 1400s when Portugal and Spain began snapping up territories along Africa's west coast. By 1500, more than 50,000 Africans are thought to have been enslaved and put to work either in West African colonies or back in Europe. This skyrocketed over the next 3 centuries as the European colonization of the Americas led to millions of Africans being enslaved and shipped across the Atlantic. While the majority of slaves were taken from the west coast regions, plenty more inland Africans were also caught and sold, often by their fellow Africans. Regions that were especially targeted include today's Senegal, Gambia, Mali, and West Central Africa. Other areas that suffered were Angola, Congo, Nigeria, Cameroon, and Gabon. The slave trade was extensive. It's believed that almost 17 million Africans were enslaved and shipped overseas during the slavery boom, and that lasted until well into the 19th century. Portugal, Spain, and then Britain were the major countries involved in establishing slave systems that rewarded their own economies while severely handicapping the prospect of growth in Africa. Slavery robbed huge areas of Africa of adults in their physical prime, which meant a dire shortage of workers, which were essential to help kickstart any agricultural and industrial development. It also meant serious drops in birth rates due to the number of women who'd been taken away from Africa to work in the Americas. This put Africa at a huge disadvantage from the outset. When the Industrial Revolution took hold in England and then spread to North America, Africa's purpose was to supply slave labor and raw materials for the European powers. It was a million miles away from being able to reap any of the benefits of the industrialization. The mass depopulation meant that Africa was unable to produce the goods and services that were crucial to economic development. Slavery was just the first factor that contributed to Africa's poor rate of development. When slavery was finally abolished in the mid-19th century, the next stage of Africa's struggle began: colonization and exploitation. Industrialization had brought untold wealth to the Western European nations, and they were keen to keep the momentum going. As more and more people flocked to live and work in the European cities, more raw materials were needed to feed the rapidly modernizing cities. And by the late 19th century, this had led to the so-called scramble for Africa. Africa was renowned for its wealth of riches: timber, ivory, rubber, palm oil, tin, tea, diamonds, and silver, to name a few. Britain, France, Spain, Germany, and Belgium were all competing for a slice of the African pie, and territory started to be seized up and colonized at breakneck speed. In the 1870s, Africans owned roughly 90% of their land, and the European colonies were mainly restricted to the coastlines. And yet by the turn of the century, the number had reversed, and almost 90% of Africa had fallen into foreign hands. The colonizing powers wasted no time in stripping Africa of its natural resources, all of which were used to increase production and development back in Europe. Almost no effort was made in using the resources to build up the local African economies. Instead, the colonizers set up factories throughout Africa that were mainly used for the basic processing of raw materials. These were then shipped off to Europe and then processed into finished goods that were then sold back to Africans, completing the cycle of stunted development. African farmers were only permitted to grow crops or mine minerals that benefited the European colonies. On top of that, the farmers were paid a pittance for their efforts, which made it almost impossible to acquire any wealth or basic savings. And by the time World War II broke out, Africa had made little progress since the early days of slavery. The continent had suffered serious depopulation and then was subjected to the widespread economic exploitation throughout much of the 19th century and well into the 20th century. When the Europeans began withdrawing from Africa in the decades after World War II, there was a belief amongst the African nations. Maybe now, with the shackles released, they could finally use up their independence to make a real go of things and realize their potential. Unfortunately, this was an illusion. Up until the decolonization period, much of Africa's slow development was caused by external factors. However, the independence of African nations resulted in serious economic mismanagement by those in charge, widespread political corruption, and ensuing civil wars. Added to this was an alarming rate of disease-related mortalities, which further weighed down any chances Africa had to make positive progress. Without a doubt, the most detrimental issue has been political corruption. The misuse of public funds, the secret stashing of billions of dollars, and the manipulation of elections have put the brakes on any chance that Africa has had to modernize its economy and attract much-needed investment. By 1991, a corruption investigation reported over that $200 billion had been pocketed by politicians in that year alone. Since independence, it's thought that Africa has lost close to $1 trillion in illicitly managed finances. This was either simply taken from tax revenues or the lofty payments made by international corporations in exchange for petroleum and minerals. Across the board, governments have failed to reinvest the sizable earnings from governments back into their respective economies. And as a result, education, infrastructure, healthcare, and business sectors have all suffered considerably. African governments have been guilty of putting all of their eggs into the raw material basket, and this over-reliance on resources has stunted growth in other areas. It led to over-borrowing from foreign creditors in the 70s and 80s, and the crippling debt that followed has been telling. What Africa has been crying out for is serious investment in goods and services that promote technology. East and Southeast Asian countries were able to do this incredibly well, and they now have some of the world's most advanced economies. However, a significant difference between Asia's rise and Africa's stagnation has been political stability. The mass corruption against African governments has led to bloody civil wars that have further ravaged the continent. In over 50 years following the independence, 48 of the 54 African countries were engaged in a civil war of some kind. Not only does this obviously stunt any progress, but it also produces displaced populations too exhausted or disillusioned to bring about any change. It all paints a very gloomy picture. However, despite its painful past and current woes, many Africans remain optimistic about the future. The continent still has a vast wealth of natural resources and the world's youngest population, with 60% of Africans being under the age of 25. It all comes down to stable and accountable governments. If Africa can establish democracies that are focused on building sustainable futures, foreign investment in the right area will follow. As dire as the situation in Africa may seem, there are still plenty of reasons for hope.